All right. So, welcome back to part 2 of Understanding Initiation. I'm going to do a quick review since I think most of those of you guys that are here today, I don't think you guys were there for the first one. So, we'll do a quick review of what we went over last time. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So we started out with the question of why initiation. What is the value of initiation, particularly for modern people, modern humans? For those of us in the OTO, why does initiation play a central role? Why don't we just do some other type of ritual work or some other type of group activity? What is it about initiation that is unique? So that was the question that we were framing our approach with. And then the next question logically is, what is initiation? So we talked about some different definitions of that, and we talked about the etymology of the word initiation, which comes from the Latin initium, which means a going in, a coming in, an entrance or beginning. And it was also used by the ancient Romans to refer to the sacred rites and mysteries themselves. And then we went through a couple definitions. Mircea Eliade's definition is the one that I thought was the best. So I'll reread that one here. The term initiation in the most general sense denotes a body of rites and oral teachings whose purpose is to produce a decisive alteration in the religious and social status of the person to be initiated. In philosophical terms, initiation is equivalent to a basic change in existential condition. The novice emerges from his ordeal endowed with a totally different being from that which he possessed before his initiation. He has become another. So we talked a little bit about Eliade, who he is. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that now. You can look him up if you want to learn more, if you're not familiar with him. This is a picture of him when he was young, when he traveled to India. He was a historian of religion, among other things. So because we're going to be referencing his work a lot, I'm going to reread his little description of what a historian of religion does. It says, the ambition of the historian of religion is to arrive at the existential situation assumed by religious man in the experience of initiation and to make that primordial experience intelligible to his contemporaries. So then we talked about one of the other sources that we use a lot here is René Guénon. I talked a little bit about him. I won't go into too much detail now. I addressed that he's linked to the traditionalist school. He's a guy I have a lot of disagreements with. We'll get into some of that here in a little bit. But I think that he also had some really valuable ideas. He wrote a book called Perspectives on Initiation. And that's what we're going to be referring a lot to when we cite Guénon. So we jumped into the different types of initiation. And we talked about Mircea Eliade's division, which falls into two main categories, the one being puberty rites and the second being specialized initiation, which he broke down into three subsections. The first one being secret societies, the second one being like a mystical vocation, some sort of priest or shaman, and then the third being a martial vocation, which we talked about. I have down here berserkers because Eliade references that quite a bit. But we also talked about last time, the Templars would fall kind of actually into both categories, B and C. The Templars would have been a martial organization, but there was also a religious mystical component to it as well. So that's just kind of gives you an idea of the way that initiation is broken down. The main thing is really sort of separating these puberty rites, which everyone in pre-modern societies would have gone through. Practically everyone in pre-modern societies would have gone through some sort of puberty rite. This is a pretty universal thing all over the world throughout history. But then the second category of specialized initiations, this is obviously something that not everyone would have gone through. Only people who are fulfilling certain roles or joining certain mystery cults or secret societies. So, but I think that the broader themes of initiation are relevant to both puberty rites and specialized initiation. And I think when we go through the themes in initiation, you can kind of see how they apply to both categories. We talked about this guy, Arnold van Gennep, who was an ethnologist and a historian. And he talked about this three-phased structure of initiation, which became really influential on Mircea Eliade and other writers when they were studying initiation. So we'll go over this real quick here. There's the first phase of initiation is a separation from the old social position or state of being. The second phase is a marginal or liminal state in which the candidate found himself between the old and the new states. And then third, there is an aggregation or incorporation into the new state. In the last class, someone asked, I can't remember who it was, someone asked if the EIO formula corresponded to this three-phase structure. And we determined that if you switch the order around slightly, it actually does fit. So the first phase, the separation, is similar to the Apophis phase. The marginal or liminal state is similar in some ways to the Isis stage, the wanderings of Isis. And then the third, the aggregation or incorporation, would correspond to the Osiris part of the formula. So that's just a thelemic magical way to kind of look at this academic breakdown of initiation. So then we jumped into themes, and we only got through about half of the themes and patterns last time, but I'll quickly review. We started out by talking about death, which corresponds to that first phase, the separation phase. Death naturally is followed by some sort of rebirth, resurrection, or renewal, which corresponds to the aggregation or incorporation phase in that the three-phase breakdown we just talked about. So we're not going to talk about a lot of detail here, so that way we can move on into the other themes and patterns. But we talked about, how it is that various themes of rebirth and resurrection show up in initiations. We talked about the descent into hell, which corresponds to this whole death rebirth motif. Someone had asked me who the artist was. I had this piece of art here, and I didn't know at the time, but I looked it up, and the artist's name is Adolf. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but you can read it right there. Hierome Herschel. He was a symbolist painter from the late 19th century. So he's got a lot of other really cool pieces of art that a lot of them are mythologically based. So then we talked about, with this whole theme of the descent into hell, Eliade analyzes how it often corresponds to this sort of belly in the whale element of being absorbed by some monster. In archaic cultures, it was often viewed as the goddess of the underworld, or the earth goddess, who would swallow the initiate, and then there would be this sort of gestation that occurs in the belly of the goddess. But this obviously corresponds to the biblical story of Jonah and the whale, which is why we have this painting here. We then jumped into the notion of transmission, and how initiation purports to transmit some sort of gnosis or wisdom. And we talked about the different ideas around that. And then we talked about the origins of initiation, how in many cultures and many different initiatory traditions, the origins of initiation are viewed as being transcendent or divine, and some sort of divine beings or mythical beings or ancestors are the ones that are transmitting the wisdom. They're the ones that sort of that the initiation originates from. So that leaves us with, hold on one second here. I just got logged out of my other computer where I have all my other notes on. Okay. So this leaves us with the idea of the eternal return, which is where we left off last time. So the eternal return is this notion that Mircea Eliade came up with, that he used to analyze all sorts of different religious phenomena. But in particular, when he was discussing initiation, he thought it was very valid. So he talks about this, and a lot of the stuff we're quoting from with Eliade is going to be from a book called Rites and Symbols of Initiation, which, if you can only read one book to try to better understand initiation, I would put it at the top of my list in terms of recommendations. But this is a quote from that book. He says, "The repetition of a ritual founded by divine beings implies the reactualization of the original time when the rite was performed. This is why a rite has efficacy. It participates in the completeness of the sacred primordial time. The rite makes the myth present." So he's very keen on this idea that within initiation, along with many other types of ritual, there's this primordial time that's being accessed. You're not simply commemorating something that happened, whether it's the creation of the universe or, some other sort of, sacrifice of some ancestor. You're not simply commemorating this event, but you're actually re-accessing this primordial sort of eternal time. So here we have a quote from Rene Guénon, where he says, "We might add that the vertical transmission, which we have just envisaged as from above, when taken in the reverse direction from below, becomes a participation by humanity in realities of the principal order. Indeed, a participation assured by tradition in all its forms, since it is precisely through it that humanity is put into effective contact with a superior order. For its part, horizontal transmission, if considered as a reascent over the course of time, becomes a return to origins, a restoration of the primordial state. And we have already indicated that this restoration is precisely a necessary condition for man to raise himself effectively to the superior states." So, in other words, if we kind of take this idea of the eternal return and what's happening within initiation, this is putting not only the initiate, but the entire group that's participating in this initiation, it's putting them back into contact with this primordial state, which is part of the reason that there's this renewal and rebirth, this regenerative effect that is associated with initiations. So then we have, this kind of leads naturally to another idea here, which when we go back to that breakdown into the different types of initiation, you have specialized initiations, and in particular, you have these, the idea of mystical vocation, right? This is a specialized sort of calling that not everyone is going to engage in. But for those that do, there's this transcending of the ordinary human state. So Eliade, he has a whole book on shamanism. He talks a lot about shamanic initiation, but you could look at a lot of other types of initiation as relating to this notion of transcending the human entirely. I think there's a lot of secret societies that at least claim to do this with their initiations. So there's a quote here from Eliade where he says, "Those who submitted to initiation then sought thereby to obtain a superhuman ontological status, more or less divine, and to ensure their survival after death, if not their immortality." And of course, immortality is a theme that comes up in a lot of different initiatory traditions. It comes up in the OTO. It comes up in yoga. It comes up in a variety of different traditions. So more here from Iliad. He says, here we find the explanation not only for the appearance of secret societies, but also for the organization of the confraternities of medicine men, shamans, and mystics of all kinds. The underlying idea is both simple and fundamental. If the sacred is accessible to every human being, including women, it is not exhausted in its first revelations. So he's referring there to the puberty rites that everyone would undergo, which is sort of your first introduction to the sacred. Religious experience and knowledge have degrees, higher and yet higher planes, which by their very nature cannot be attained by all. Deeper religious experience and knowledge demand a special vocation or exceptional willpower and intelligence. Just as a man cannot become a shaman or a mystic simply by wanting to, so he cannot rise to certain initiatory degrees unless he demonstrates that he possesses spiritual qualities. So this leads into the idea of the separation between the greater and lesser mysteries, which those who've studied the Western initiatory tradition are probably familiar with. But both Iliad and Guénon go into the examples of like what separates the lesser mysteries from the greater mysteries. So this is from René Guénon. He says, the lesser mysteries comprise all that is related to the development of the possibilities of the human state envisaged in its entirety. They therefore end in what we have called the perfection of the state, namely in what is traditionally called the restoration of the primordial state. The greater mysteries, on the other hand, concern the realization of the superhuman states, taking the being at the point where the lesser mysteries have left it, that is, the center of the domain of human individuality. They lead it beyond this domain. Through the supra-individual states that are still conditioned to the unconditioned state that alone is the true goal of all initiation, and that is called the final deliverance or the supreme identity. To characterize these two phases, one can apply geometric symbolism and speak of horizontal realization and vertical realization, respectively, the first serving as a basis for the second. This basis is represented symbolically by the earth, which corresponds to the human domain. And you can see here this little picture I have, which kind of relates this same idea, but with slightly different terminology. But there you've got the earth there at the center of the circle. This basis is represented symbolically by the earth, which corresponds to the human domain, and the superhuman realization is then described as an ascent through the heavens, which correspond to the superior states of the being. So this was a common theme, like in the rites of Mithras and in other initiatory traditions. You have this ascent through the seven spheres, right? The traditional planets, which you can see here on this little diagram. Sorry, I lost my place there. Moreover, it is easy to understand why the second necessarily presupposes the first. The center of the human state is the only point where direct communication with the superior states is possible. And this is accomplished along the vertical axis, which intersects the human domain at this point. It is therefore necessary to have reached this center first in order to raise oneself thereafter along the axis to the super-individual states. And this is why, to use the language of Dante, the terrestrial paradise is a stage on the path leading to the celestial paradise. So that's what you have represented here in this diagram. This ascent from Earth. Earth would be where the lesser mysteries are realized. And once you've fully actualized that natural, mundane human state, you can then rise through the spheres all the way to the heavens or the celestial paradise there at the top of the diagram. So just to kind of summarize and break this down about the difference between the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries, we have these two columns here. So for the lesser mysteries, we have this idea of becoming fully human and the idea of a complete initiation into the primordial state of humanity. And then with the greater mysteries, you're transcending the human state and you have initiation into the realms of divinity, culminating in union with the ultimate reality. All right, so now we're going to move on to the theme of secrecy, which is a common theme in all sorts of initiatory traditions, not just in Western initiations. So I'm going to read a quote here from Henrik Bogdan, who is he's a current scholar of esotericism, and he talks about why secrecy is a thing in initiations. He says here, the secret of a Western esoteric ritual of initiation is the experience of undergoing the ritual, an experience that by definition is non-communicable. The experience of undergoing a ritual of initiation is tantamount to that of a mystical experience, and one characteristic of mystical experience is the difficulty in expressing and describing it verbally. So then Rene Guénon, he spends a lot of time talking about this in his book, Perspectives on Initiation. He says, the initiatic secret can never be betrayed, since in itself, and in a way by definition, it is inaccessible to and ungraspable by the profane, and so cannot be penetrated by them, since knowledge of it can only be the consequence of initiation itself. In fact, this secret is of such a nature that words cannot express it, which is why, as we shall explain more completely in what follows, the initiatic teaching can only use rites and symbols that suggest rather than express in the ordinary sense of the word. Properly speaking, what is transmitted by initiation is not the secret itself, since this is incommunicable, but the spiritual influence of the rite's vehicle, and that makes possible the interior work, by means of which, with the symbols as base and support, each one will attain that secret and penetrate it more or less completely, more or less profoundly, according to the measure of his own possibilities of comprehension and realization. So I think a lot of people who are unfamiliar with initiation and with initiatory orders, they'll often ask, what's with all this secrecy? And a lot of people seem to have the idea that, well, like, oh, if I read the initiation scripts, whether we're talking about the OTO or Freemasonry or any organization where you can access, there's all kinds of stuff you can find on the internet. But with all of these initiations, people seem to think, oh, if I read the scripts, then I'll know the secrets. And what Guénon and Bogdan are getting at with these quotes is that this type of person is missing the point entirely. The secret is not something that's communicable in words. It's not something that is communicable on paper. So just reading an initiation script is not going to give you the secret. It's an experiential thing. And Guénon is pointing out here too that the communication of the secret it occurs through symbols and through the rite itself, but it kind of opens the door to the interior work, which the initiate then has to go further with the interior work to really discover the secret. In other words, we're talking about something that it becomes very individual, and it's only experiential. It's not a rational thing. So then Guénon goes on and talks about, why all the secret signs and handshakes and whatnot. He says that the secret in question is itself a symbol of the true initiatic secret, which is obviously much more than a mere pedagogical means. But here, of course, no less than elsewhere, the symbol, by symbol here, I mean, he's referring to any sort of secret word or handshake or sign or whatever it is. He says the symbol must not be confused with what is symbolized. And this is the confusion effected by profane ignorance, because it does not see beyond appearances and does not even imagine that there can be anything besides what strikes the senses, which is practically equivalent to the pure and simple negation of all symbolism. So I kind of summarized these ideas here on secrecy. There's a three-part purpose behind the secrecy of the signs and the means of recognition and all that. So the first part is that there's a practical function of discerning initiates from non-initiates, right? So that's the most basic reason you have all these signs and handshakes and whatnot. But then there's a second reason that goes further, and this is treating the signs as sacred due to their symbolic connection to the secret, which is ultimately incommunicable. And then there's a third element too, and this is the discipline of silence. A discipline which can be useful when applied to understanding the true initiatic secret. So this relates back to the interior work that Guénon is talking about. The discipline of silence itself, this type of discipline is very useful in the interior work that you need to do to fully realize the secret within yourself. So now we're going to move on to another theme. And this is the theme of hierarchy. So Guénon, he has kind of an axe to grind. This gets into one of the areas I disagree with him. He's very anti-modern world, and he's very anti-democratic. And he argues that initiatory organizations are, by their very nature, they're hierarchical and non-democratic. And he sort of goes after the Freemasons for incorporating democratic ideas into their organization. It's just kind of his own silly nonsense. But I do think there's an interesting dichotomy that he brings up, where there is this innately hierarchical element that you find in most initiatory organizations. So when he's analyzing this, he talks about it in terms of two symbols, the pyramid and the circle. So this quote here kind of goes into more detail about that. The initiatic hierarchy, however, is distinguished in a special way from all the others. It is formed essentially by degrees of knowledge, with all that is implied by this word taken in its true sense. For it is in this that the degrees of initiation themselves consist. Some people have represented these degrees by a series of concentric enclosures that must be successfully traversed, which is a very exact image. For here it is indeed a question of approaching closer and closer to a center until the last degree is finally reached. So this is a Kabbalistic glyph that is an example of the circle as a way of sort of perceiving the different degrees and the hierarchy within initiation, where you're moving from the outside of the circle, you're moving closer and closer to a center point. And then the other way of looking at it is the pyramid. And I found this really great diagram, which breaks down the basic Illuminati structure. But going back to Guénon here, he talks about the pyramid. He says, others have compared the initiatic hierarchy to a pyramid, the courses of which continually narrow as they rise from the base to the summit. Here again, ending at a unique point that plays the same role as the center does in the preceding figure. Whatever the symbolism adopted in this regard, it is precisely this hierarchy of degrees that we had in mind when speaking of the successive distinctions effected within the elite. So then he goes on to say, individual human possibilities have not yet been surpassed. Consequently, as we've already pointed out, the degrees within any initiatic organization never represent more than a sort of general classification. That is, like all such classifications, necessarily schematic and limited to certain principal or clearly defined stages. According to the particular point of view adopted in establishing such a classification, the degrees so distinguished can naturally vary in number without such differences being contradictory or incompatible. For this question bears on no doctrinal principle and merely relates to the special methods peculiar to each initiatic organization. In other words, different initiatic groups break it down in all sorts of different ways. This silly little pyramid diagram I found, actually probably created by some evangelical right-wing nut. They take all sorts of different initiatory groups and try to like jam them all together in this pyramid. It's pretty silly, but I thought you guys might get a kick out of it. But the nonsense notwithstanding, this idea of the degrees placed on a pyramid is something you find not only in the OTO, but in all sorts of different initiatory orders. But what Gwenan is saying here is that, you can break it down Hello?
Hello? We lost your audio for a second, but now I hear you. Lost it again, I think.
Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So Gwenan points out that the only fundamental distinction in terms of the different
Yes.
degrees is really between the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. Whether you're talking about the OTO or Freemasonry or the Golden Dawn, people break it down into all sorts of different degrees, including, a lot of the Rites of Memphis and Mizraim. I think they have 97 degrees. It gets kind of absurd with the level of detail that it gets to. But Gwenan is saying really the fundamental distinction, however you break it down, is between the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. So then there's this other idea kind of going further with this, that the allocation of the members of an initiatic organization among its different degrees is only symbolic, as it were, with respect to the real hierarchy, because initiation at every degree can in many cases only be virtual, in which case naturally only degrees of theoretical knowledge would be in question. But that at least is what it should always be normally. If initiation were always effective or had to become effective before the individual had access to a higher degree, the two hierarchies would entirely coincide. But even if this is perfectly conceivable in principle, it must be recognized that it's hardly realizable in fact, and is even less likely in certain organizations. So the distinction we have just noted naturally resolves the objection that could occur to some readers whom whatever initiatic organization with which they may be familiar have observed, even at the higher degrees, not to mention the summit of the apparent hierarchy, individuals who all too obviously lack any effective initiation. So what he's getting at here is that the degrees themselves are just a representation of possible attainment, and they don't actually represent what he's using the term virtual initiation versus effective initiation to essentially say that if you go through the degrees in an order, that's the sort of virtual initiation, which opens the doorway to the possibility of effective initiation. But that work has to be done on one's own. So in other words, I could be a 33rd degree Freemason, but that doesn't mean that I'm effectively initiated to the extent that I could be if I haven't done all of the interior work necessary to realize those degrees. So then there's a further distinction, which I think is really useful, especially in the OTO, but I think it's useful probably in a lot of different organizations. And it's important to note that neither Gwenan nor Iliad had any real knowledge of the OTO. So when I say that when I'm using their quotes to talk about the OTO structure, it's just coincidental. And it's really just because I think they did a good job of analyzing initiatory groups as a whole and the sort of universal elements that connect so many of them. So there's this distinction between degrees and functions that Gwenan makes. So he says another important point is that an initiatic organization includes not only a hierarchy of degrees, but also a hierarchy of functions, and that these are two entirely distinct things that must never be confused. For the function with which someone may be invested at a given level does not confer upon him a new degree and does not modify in any way the one he already possesses. The function has, so to speak, only an accidental character with respect to the degree. The exercise of a given function may require the possession of this or that degree, but it is never bound necessarily to that degree, however elevated this may be. And what is more, the function may be only temporary, and thus can come to an end for a variety of reasons, whereas the degree always constitutes a permanent acquisition, one that is obtained once and for all and which can never be lost by any means, regardless of whether it is a question of an effective initiation or merely a virtual initiation. So in other words, what he's saying, if you think about this in the context of the OTO, there are certain degrees at which you become eligible to fulfill offices. But the fulfillment of those offices might be temporary, right? Like you could sit on the electoral college, which is something that you can't do until you reach a certain degree. But that's sitting on the electoral college is only a temporary thing. And when you're done sitting in that office, it doesn't mean that you somehow lose your degree. The degree is a separate thing that is ongoing, for the rest of your life. So it's a worthwhile distinction to make. So we talked a little bit about this virtual initiation versus effective initiation. There's another really good quote here where he says, virtual initiation is therefore initiation understood in the strictest sense of the word, that is as an entering or a beginning. So this goes back to the notion that we had before about the etymology of the word initiation coming from the Latin word that means a beginning. This, of course, is by no means to say that it can be regarded as something sufficient unto itself, but only that it is the necessary starting point for all the rest. Having started on a path, one is still to follow it, and if one can, even follow it to its end. This can be summed up in a few words. Entering on the path is virtual initiation. In other words, going through the formal rite of initiation is what he's calling the virtual initiation. This is just the beginning point. Following the path is effective initiation. But unfortunately, many in fact remain on the threshold, not always because they are incapable of going further, but also, especially in the present conditions of the Western world, because of the degeneration of certain organizations. So this, once again, he has this sort of axe to grind. But he's saying that some initiations have become solely speculative, whereas others are operative. So this kind of gets into debates within Freemasonry. I don't have time to go into all that. But the point remains that if you look at the rite of initiation itself being the beginning point or the starting point, but the effective initiation is something that requires the individual to go further on their own, to go further in their investigations and in their interior work to fully realize the initiation and make it effective. So this brings us to one of our last sort of major themes of initiation. And this is the idea that initiation is related to the fulfillment of one's true nature. And this is where I think initiation corresponds very interestingly to Thelema as a philosophy. So another quote here from Guénon, he says, on this last point, it suffices to recall that the diversity of modes of initiation, whether among different traditional forms or within one, where a traditional social organization exists, even in the outward order, each person occupies the place that befits his own individual nature. And if he is qualified, this very fact allows him more easily to find the mode of initiation that corresponds to his own possibilities. Thus, if we consider the caste system from this point of view, the initiation of the Kshatriyas cannot be identical with that of the Brahmins and so forth. And in a yet more particular way, a certain form of initiation can be linked to the practice of a given craft and cannot be completely effective unless the craft practiced by the individual is indeed that to which he is destined by the aptitudes inherent in his very nature, so that these aptitudes will also be at the same time an integral part of the special qualifications required for the corresponding form of initiation. On the contrary, where nothing is any longer organized according to traditional and normal rules, as with the modern West, there results a confusion that extends to all domains and that inevitably entails many complications and difficulties regarding the precise determination of initiatic qualifications. Since the place of the individual in society no longer has then anything but a remote connection to his nature, with only its most outward and least important aspects most often taken into consideration. That is to say, those aspects that really have no value, even a secondary one from the initiatic point of view. So what he's getting at here is that initiation especially if you're looking at specialized initiation into secret societies, or into, he uses the example here of the castes. If you're initiated into the warrior caste or into the priest caste, or into a particular craft, because we have to keep in mind that throughout much of ancient and medieval history and many different cultures, if you were going to take up a particular craft, a particular discipline, a particular, what we would call a career path today, you would be initiated into that. It wasn't strictly, you would learn the skills of the craft, but there was also a religious dimension to it as well. That there was, wisdom being passed down from master to apprentice and whatnot. And this is something that we're largely lacking in the modern world. And what he's getting at here is that, initiation, if one, is following the right path, this initiation will allow one to tap into your natural aptitudes in a much deeper sense, and really fulfill your role. So Iliad takes this idea even further. He says that it is through initiation that in primitive and archaic societies, man becomes what he is and what he should be, a being open to the life of the spirit, hence one who participates in the culture into which he is born. For as we shall soon see, the puberty initiation represents above all the revelation of the sacred. And for the primitive world, the sacred means not only everything that we now understand by religion, but also the whole body of the tribe's mythological and cultural traditions. So even with puberty rites, as opposed to specialized initiations, you're given this sort of role in society. You're sort of formally accepted in society in a way that doesn't happen to the same degree now. So this is a photo of Iliad as an older man. We saw the photo earlier of him as a younger man. So we're going to close out here with a couple quotes from Iliad. So he goes on discussing initiation. He says, "It is as if initiation and its patterns were indissolubly linked with the very structure of spiritual life, as if initiation were an indispensable process in every attempt at total regeneration, in every effort to transcend man's natural condition and attain to a sanctified mode of being." So he talks about the idea of initiation for the modern human and why it's still pertinent to modern humans. He talks about initiation as being linked very much to life itself. And I think if you look at the origins of initiation, sort of from a cultural and psychological standpoint, you could argue that the patterns of initiation exist as a way of ancient humans making sense of life itself, which there's a lot of things that haven't changed for modern humans. So when Iliad's discussing this, he goes on to say that we recognize them, meaning the patterns of initiation, in certain types of real ordeals that the modern human undergoes, in spiritual crises, in the solitude and despair through which every human being must pass in order to attain to a responsible, genuine, and creative life. Even if the initiatory character of these ordeals is not apprehended as such, it remains true nonetheless that man becomes himself only after having solved a series of desperately difficult and even dangerous situations. That is, after having undergone tortures and death, followed by an awakening to another life, qualitatively different because regenerated. If we look closely, we see that every human life is made up of a series of ordeals, of deaths, and of resurrections. It is true that in the case of modern man, since there is no longer any religious experience fully and consciously assumed, initiation no longer performs an ontological function. It no longer includes a radical change in the initiate's mode of being or his salvation. The initiatory scenarios function only on the vital and psychological planes. Nevertheless, they continue to function. And that is why I said that the process of initiation seems to be coexistent with any and every human condition. So he also goes on to talk about how initiation, even though initiatory organizations are much rarer, there's not that many people doing the type of stuff that that we do in the OTO or in other, initiatory orders, whether it be Freemasonry or whether it be other traditional religious organizations in other parts of the world that still do initiation. It's less and less common. But he talks about how, despite the lack of formal initiation, that these initiatory elements pop up in modern culture. And he talks about novels and movies where these initiatory themes pop up again and again and again. And he's arguing that this, because we don't, at least as a culture, Western culture as a whole, we no longer participate in these formal initiations. We've sort of pushed this down into almost into the subconscious, and then it erupts in culture in other ways. And so in particular, he talks about novels and films and artwork, which is where many people experience these sorts of initiatory themes. So I think you can think about, the Star Wars movies or the Harry Potter books, and you can see all these same initiatory themes running through these, hugely popular sort of pop culture trends. These cultural touchstones, like, Star Wars and Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, all that kind of stuff. So going a little further here with Iliad, he says that initiation lies at the core of any genuine human life. And this is true for two reasons. The first is that any genuine human life implies profound crises, ordeals, suffering, loss, and reconquest of self. The second is that whatever degree of fulfillment it may have brought him at a certain moment, every man sees his life as a failure. This vision does not arise from a moral judgment made on his past, but from an obscure feeling that he has missed his vocation. That is, he has betrayed the best that was in him. In such moments of total crisis, only one hope seems to offer any issue: the hope of beginning life over again. This means, in short, that the man undergoing such a crisis dreams of new, regenerated life, fully realized and significant. This is something other and far more than the obscure desire of every human soul to renew itself periodically, as the cosmos is renewed. The hope and dream of these moments of total crisis are to obtain a definitive and total renovatio, a renewal capable of transmuting life. Such a renewal is the result of every genuine religious conversion. But genuine and definitive conversions are comparatively rare in modern societies. To us, this makes it all the more significant that even non-religious men sometimes, in the depths of their being, feel the desire for this kind of spiritual transformation, which in other cultures constitutes the very goal of initiation. It does not fall to us to determine to what extent traditional initiations fulfilled their promises. The important fact is that they proclaimed their intention and professed to possess the means of transmuting human life. The nostalgia for an initiatory renewal which sporadically arises from the inmost depths of modern non-religious man hence seems to us highly significant. It would appear to represent the modern formulation of man's eternal longing to find a positive meaning in death, to accept death as a transition right to a higher mode of being. If we can say that initiation constitutes a specific dimension of human existence, this is true above all because it is only in initiation that death is given a positive value. Death prepares the new, purely spiritual birth, access to a mode of being not subject to the destroying action of time. So that does it for what I had to present. Do you guys have any questions or comments?
Thank you, David. That was lovely.
Yes,
You're
that's
welcome.
very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, that was good.
I did have a question regarding like initiation at this point, since we are kind of in the pandemic pause of initiation. What are your thoughts about the possibility of initiations going virtual? And there has been a test run of that this summer with Chicken Kabbalah. There was a 3-degree initiation that did happen, and I thought it was fantastic. And if more developed, could even possibly be a interesting way of doing initiations in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it. I think that during the pandemic, I think it makes sense to do that. But as like a broader trend, I'm kind of suspicious about it, just because I feel like modern humans are becoming less and less in touch with their bodies and in touch with the physical, and we're becoming more and more digitally immersed and virtually immersed. And I feel like if we start doing our rites of initiation just through computers and whatnot, digitally, virtually, I feel like there's the potential of losing something there. I do think it makes sense to do it during the pandemic when we can't get together physically. But I would be very resistant to seeing it as something that would continue after the pandemic. But that's just my general feeling about like technology and the way that we relate to it.
Dave, I'll just sign in and say I totally agree with your assessment on that.
Yeah, I do. I think we would lose something, I mean, because, like David was just explaining, that so much of this, you can't read it off of a piece of paper and get that. And I think that there's the experience, and then there's other things. And
it's not just that, though. It's also that I think to a large extent, modern humans, in addition to being less in touch with their bodies, are also less fully developed in their imagination skills. And in order to conduct an effective long distance initiation of any variety, you need to be able to visualize and conjure the smell of, and the scent of, and the sound of all of these different things, and the feeling of something on your skin. And I think that takes a lot of practice to get good at. And it's very difficult for, your average person off the street, if you grabbed them and said, okay, ready, now imagine this, they're not going to have anywhere near the same depth of experience as they would have if it were physical and in person. I mean, and that's why when we talk about ritual and doing ritual in person, we talk about what kind of visual impact things have, how we're placing people, whether we're bellowing or speaking or whispering or singing, whether we have music playing, whether there are scents or candles or things burning. All that gets lost virtually. Plus, as David said, we are already so out of touch with the meat suit. We really need to get it out and walk it about a little more. I mean, your mileage may vary.
Thank you. I appreciate your perspectives, all of you. Thank you very much.
I concur. From personal experience, I can't imagine getting 90% out of what I got from physically experiencing the whole thing.
It is, I think, interesting to think about. I can't remember, somebody else probably knows specifically where Crowley talks about this, but he talks somewhere about doing OTO initiations for someone who was deaf, I believe, and how he realized that there was so much of the verbiage and the words in the degree that was just unnecessary, and that he could do everything he needed to do without using all the words. And I think that's interesting to think about in terms of, the physical element of doing it in person.
I agree. Yeah, it was amazing when I looked at some of the copies of the, early rituals, and then, what Crowley did with them. And it's quite brilliant. And it's really just boiling it down to the essence of what you're there for without so much blah, blah, blah. You know?
Well, and in the early days of the OTO, people were basically getting initiations by mail, like, here's this, read it and let me know if you have questions. And I think that in an attempt to reach back towards how life used to be experienced, we've become better at moving forward and developing those rituals into the physical creatures that they are now.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, what makes them so effective, is the fact that there's experience and experience and experience, and this, what works, what doesn't, for way before Crowley. I mean, these were already quite established rituals when Crowley took and created the OTO rituals, and I'm sure the same is true in all the traditions who take their rituals seriously, that they refine and refine. And, I think what we've got today, are very valuable in that sense, that they're highly effective in what they set out to do and what they accomplish.
It's not to say that the other types of initiations aren't effective, written as they are to be done at a distance. I think it would be difficult you wouldn't be able to take the rituals we have now and do them at a distance and get the same impact. But you could have a different ritual written with the intent of being performed at a distance that could have a similar impact.
Right. And the other thing too is, like, you could have the most amazing ritual, but if you as a person are not open to the change that a initiation brings, it's not going to be effective. You also have to take that role in putting yourself, I feel, in the mindset when I did do the virtual initiation, if I would have gone into it thinking, oh, this is virtual and this is not going to do anything and I'm not going to get anything out of it, and I don't want to have any change, and I'm not, jonesing for initiation or anything because of the pandemic. So I went into it with like a full mind, being like, I want to experience initiation in my astral. I'm going to take it on. I'm going to do it, to the fullest that I can show up for. And I got so much out of it doing that. So it's not just, I feel, that things can get lost in translation, but like, I really like Makai's point that if you redesigned a ritual to affect someone in the same way that you would in a certain degree of initiation, then and do it virtually, that you could have success in that. And I think that's something that could be important to consider depending on how things play out.
Well, and two, one thing to consider as well is the idea of self-initiation. I mean, I've been initiated as far as I've been initiated in the OTO, but I have also self-initiated in private, in my own magical system, that sometimes has surpassed my OTO degree, and then my OTO degree kind of catches up a little bit, or it's apples and oranges really, but some sort of an equivalent. And then there's times where I might take an OTO initiation and it'll just be like, whoa, because I'm not quite there yet. And so then that's, something like that. But there are many types of initiation. And sometimes the most effective ones are the ones you do on your own, in your own development. And then, let the OTO degree be what the OTO degree is. And you as an adept might be a much higher degree. A lot of people come into the OTO and they're already a very high degree adept, but they start off as a Minerval and they go through first and second, and they, and they may be learning some stuff along the way, but your true initiation level is I think where you yourself as a magician are at.
Right, and I recall we watched David's other presentation earlier today, so we could be on course. But that you had said something about the BOTA, the Builders of the Addendum, and their whole process is mail order lessons and self-initiation the whole way through. So, and I think it's an interesting system to look into as well.
I would also add
things I did.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say really quickly that one of the things I didn't have time to get into, but that does relate to what you were talking about, Steve, with self-initiation, is that Eliade in his book on shamanism talks about what he calls spontaneous initiation, which was like the idea of a shaman before he or she is a shaman, usually when they were like a teenager, would wander off into the wilderness and just sort of spontaneously experience initiation. It wasn't something that was formally done. It was just what he called spontaneous initiation. It was sort of a type of self-initiation. And he saw this as a cross-cultural thing that happened in a lot of shamanic cultures. So anyway, go ahead.
One could argue that, David, one could argue that Muhammad and Jesus and Moses all went through a spontaneous self-initiation when they wandered off into the desert and came back transformed. It's a common part of the initiatic
Absolutely.
narrative.
For the initiations that are sort of scripted, structured rituals, what I found, at least with the OTO rituals, is that, you know, I say took first degree and thought, wow, that was amazing. And then I walked through it with my initiator and thought, okay, now I really get it. And then I served as an officer and I was like, oh, wait, now I understand what first degree is about. And then I finally got to initiate first degree and I was like, oh my God, first degree is like this other thing too. So the more you go back and revisit or dig, or even when you take second degree and then look back at first degree, there are little light bulbs that go on or go off, whatever. Little light. You get a little more insight each time you go back and kind of hook it with stick again. Use whatever metaphor you like. I just threw them all in there together for you.
Well, and that's something I really appreciated back when we could do things the normal way, was being able to experience it in a variety of different levels and understanding it from different perspectives. And it definitely does open you up to newer ideas that you don't even get while you're in process. So it's very interesting.
And maybe even some of those, you know, ineffable, incommunicable bits, all of a sudden you get that inner aha or wordless aha where everything just moves the way it's supposed to and you feel that internal shift post-event, and it may continue post-event. It's a never-ending process if you're committed to the path, in my least humble opinion.
I totally agree. I like the idea of the rite of initiation just being the beginning point, the starting point, but that the initiation is ongoing for all the degrees that you take. The initiation is always ongoing. It never really stops.
Once you open the door, you can't really close it again.
And who would want to, honestly?
Even if you want to.
Oh, trust me, there are people that would love to take it back. Okay, but we can't do that.
Yeah, isn't that essentially like there's some part in every initiation where it's like, you're sure you want to do this, right? Because no take backsies. Okay, well then. And just like just like being born, or the act of becoming embodied, you don't really know what you're signing up for until you've already committed to an irrevocable point. You might think you know what you're getting, but you might get something, you might get that and more, you might get something else.
It's just a metaphor for life.
Really?
Perfectly pictured by the fool.
Well, I'm going to stop the recording for right now, but thank you everyone for being here, and donate money if you can. And we will see you hopefully tomorrow for Magic in the Mormon Church, or maybe Poetry Night on Monday, or possibly Melissa's talk on Braving the OTO on Tuesday. So much going on. So thank you guys for coming. 93.
Hey, Steve,